Deputy Owen Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. McDonagh. You're very welcome. I just wanted to clarify something initially in relation to the hypothetical that Deputy Doherty took you through, just to be certain of your views on the night of the guarantee, even though they weren't requested. If you had been asked into the room and you had been asked by the Taoiseach, we're thinking of guaranteeing all the banks, you would have said, don't guarantee Anglo and IMBS because they're insolvent. Was that your view?
Yeah, my view, Deputy, was that they were broken institutions. And
but would you have used that word?
Yes.
Okay. And if it had then been put to you, well, the financial regulator and the central bank have certified their solvency, what would you have said to that?
Well, I mean, the central bank and the financial regulator were the people with the statutory responsibilities around that. I mean, clearly, if I was a Taoiseach and I was looking at the guy from the NTMA who had this view, and I was turning to the financial regulator and the central bank who had the statutory responsibility to do it, I'd probably go with the central bank and the financial regulator, to be honest with you.
Okay, well then, just coming back to a couple of days and weeks previously, you said the nature of the people in the NTMA are questioning, and that the financial regulator had a problem with you asking questions. And I guess to the point where you say maybe these guys just don't know what's going on or what the situation is with the banks. So did you make those concerns known to anyone prior to the 29th?
Yeah, I mean, I would have said it to my colleagues, but I also would have said it to Kevin Cardiff.
Part of in the room would have known that the NTMA thought that the financial regulator and the central bank didn't know what was going on. Yeah,
because I mean, I remember having discussions with Kevin about this point. I said we need to get somebody in there to find out what's going on, and as I said, I sent this email because I was so concerned about it that when there was talk about Goldman Sachs doing a review of IMBS, I remember arriving home and thinking and saying, these are questions we should know the answer to. And I emailed Kevin a list of 33 questions. I said you might get him to try and find out the answers to these.
So do you know if Mr. Cardiff made that point in the meeting about the fact that the NTMA didn't have confidence in what the financial regulator and the central bank knew?
No idea, Deputy.
Okay. I think it's probably good advice, Chair, if we might request that information from Mr. Cardiff.
I'm just noting that down.
On those 2 points, as to whether he said the view of the NTMA was that those two banks were insolvent and that they didn't have confidence in the knowledge in the regulator and the central bank. And also, if we could, that email that you sent with 30 or 33 questions, could you supply that to the committee, Mr. McDonagh?
Yeah.
Thank you. Just to then move on to something that Senator O'Keefe raised earlier in relation to the deposit guarantee scheme, and just to understand a bit about what that meant. That increase from 20,000 to 100,000 was for every institution in Ireland. Was that?
Yeah.
Did you have to consult with the ECB before that change was made?
Well, it wasn't for the NTMA to consult, but I presume the Department of Finance, Mr. Bosang, I think was the contact person, would certainly have consulted with the European Commission, I understood, and I presume that the Central Bank would have communicated with the ECB.
And just, if I could clarify something on page 3 of your opening statement. This is about the meeting on the 18th of September, which Mr. Hurley gave evidence on. And this was a meeting about a deposit guarantee, not a blanket guarantee. And you were saying that the Central Bank and the financial regulator did not favour such an approach at that meeting. Did not favour a deposit guarantee.
Did not effectively a guarantee. Basically, this 20 to 100,000 was really to protect personal depositors, and there was a brief discussion about would you guarantee the wholesale deposits of the financial institutions, and it was dismissed very quickly by both the regulator and the central bank at that meeting.
Came up as a suggestion from where?
Well, I think it was an option that was just thrown on. You know, this was sort of a brainstorming session. I don't know who raised this, to be honest with you. As say, you know, because the deposits were, the institutions were losing liquidity, and the wholesale liquidity was the one that was running out the door the fastest. They're saying, is this a way of stimulating having a wholesale deposit guarantee? And I think the proposition might have been put forward maybe by the Department of Finance to the meeting, and Mr. Hurley, and I think the minutes show it, said, no, we're not in that space yet. We need to just deal with the personal deposit situation first.
So this is my next question. Not in that space yet. When you move from 20 to 100 and people start talking about wholesale as well, have we taken a particular step that is going towards a guarantee of everything?
No, because at that meeting, as I said earlier on to Senator O'Keefe, at that time, things were moving rapidly. Wholesale deposits were beginning to leave the system. Then the focus became on people getting worried about their personal deposits, and that meeting really was about personal deposits, and it came up as I recall, as an aside, as something that was just thrown out there, but it was. I think Mr. Hurley just almost immediately dismissed it and said, "No, we're here to talk about personal deposits. That's what we got to deal with here."
Okay. I'll move on from that, if I may then. And if we could look at page 27 of the booklet, is this email exchange with William Bosang of the 26th of September. And just a quick question is to clarify the third paragraph in, which is combining the take-on of the bank's balance sheets of Anglo and IBS of 110 billion and guaranteeing the others of over 420 billion. My understanding was that the liability the state was taking on with the guarantee was around 440 billion. That's the figure at the time. So just to clarify, why does the 110, is that a part of the 420? Additional to?
Combined the others about, no, I think when, at the time, we were trying to pull information together, because I said to you, we won't get much information from the regulator. So I think when you added up the balance sheets of the banks, in total assets, total liabilities, I think the gross balance sheet was about 500 billion euros. So I think that's where the two figures combined.
That was the NTMA's view of what a blanket guarantee.
Yeah, because we were just listing out, writing it out on a piece of paper and saying this is the size of Anglo's balance sheet, this is the size of IBS balance sheet, EBS's balance sheet, all other balance sheets, and just saying, not taking account of any equity or sub-debt or whatever the case is a gross size of the balance sheet.
Okay, thank you. And then just further in that email, in the next paragraph, at the very end of that, we expect to pay a lot more than Greece due to the scale relative to our GNP, as the market will be unforgiving about our problems. And you also mentioned that on page 4 of your opening statement that you were trying to build up a war chest of liquidity to deal with the emerging banking liquidity crisis, but you couldn't. There was no appetite from longer-term bond market investors to invest on the scale needed to create a cash buffer to deal with even part of the potential fallout from the banks, because of the pressures the sovereign was already experiencing in terms of funding the national debt, which during 2008 was 50 billion approximately. So in that email, are you pointing to a bailout? Are you saying that this now comes into view as a possibility for the sovereign if we take on this liability?
No, what I was pointing out, Deputy, was that if we have a problem, and it emerges as a problem, the markets would be... Yeah. No, I was talking about a guarantee here, Deputy, right? Yes, because if it turns out that you have a big problem with your banks, and nobody at the time knew the scale of the problem with the banks, that effectively markets are cruel, they will... drive up the cost of your debt funding very significantly, because if they think you're stuck for funding, they will charge you more for it. And around this time, Deputy, so to put it in a bit of context here, what was being talked about in the secured lending scheme, which the central bank didn't want anything to do with, they wanted to push the problem all onto the NTMA, would be that there would be a 20 billion secured lending programme entirely funded by the NTMA, that we go out and borrow the money in the market and put that money into a fund called Secured Lending Fund and lend it out on a collateralised basis back to the banks. So when I was talking about there, really, to be upfront with you, was that if we ended up borrowing 20 billion in the markets and lent that to the banks, and suddenly the banks couldn't pay it back, or the collateral wasn't worth that, and there was a hole in it, then, the markets would be very forgiving if we had a shortfall of 5 or 10 billion on back.
Borrowing would increase to the point which we might have to access funds in terms of a programme from the IMF?
No. There was no question of a programme in September 2008.
Well, just to clarify that, Mr. McDonagh, because in evidence from Mr. Cardiff, he said that he started to ask a few questions around that possibility in a way. So I'm wondering about a possible relationship.
Well, I saw what Mr. Cardiff said, but Mr. Cardiff, in his role, could have been. I think he said he's exploring it on a personal level, right? And if he was exploring on a personal level, he wasn't saying that to me, or I don't believe to any of my colleagues in the NTMA. What I was aware of, and the documentation points towards it, is that there was talk about the NTMA going out borrowing maybe potentially up to 20 billion and lending it back to the banks as a secured lender. And my concern would be that if the banks couldn't pay you back the 20 billion, or if the collateral you took wasn't worth 20 billion and you had to hold it, then that would have to be, basically the state would be taking the hit and the people would see you have a problem. But that was a 20 billion problem as opposed to a problem which turned out to be 64 billion.
This is thanks, Jeff. Just something to clarify for myself, though, Ben. I mean, you had a problem raising the 20 billion. There was a problem already on the sovereign borrowing rate. You didn't think the guarantee was credible for all the banks.
Yeah.
So surely then in taking on the guarantee, you were putting the sovereign lending position at risk.
Yes, but I think that...
Like a risk then, yeah. And then the consequence could be...
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I was pointing that out in my response, back to Mr. Bowsang. I mean, I had 40 minutes to give him a response. I tried to hit out as many bases as I could.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's consequences to everything that you do.
So, I haven't been clear, sorry. Was that one of the consequences you foresaw when you were responding to Mr. Bowsang?
One of the consequence I foresaw would be that in my first response, my first line of that, Deputy, if I bring it to you, it says, very difficult to answer as the potential real exposure to the exchequer of write-offs is not yet independently quantified. And if it turned out that you did have write-offs, and I was being selfish about it, if we had taken collateral that wasn't worth what the bank said it was worth, and it was write-offs for the exchequer, then the market, it's like the markets smell blood, and they would say, you have a problem. If you want to borrow money from us, you're going to pay much more. For it. There was no question that we couldn't ultimately borrow the money, but we were, I suppose, in September 2008. There was really a talk about a budget adjustment having to happen, and which was the minister was talking about doing his budget in October 2008, and this was September 2008. That Ireland was in a great position of having debt GDP ratio of 25%. Suddenly, our budget deficit was ballooning, not to do with the banks, but on the fiscal side. But now, if you add a banking problem on top of that, and at that stage, I thought maybe if we were forced to borrow 20 billion, even if we could borrow it, and it was against collateral which wasn't worth what we were given, then this would be a big issue for us.
Thank you.